Welcome to the Intelligent Teams podcast, where we interview leading thinkers from business and the sciences of mind to find new ways to help your teams and organizations thrive. I'm your host, Daniel Susser. Welcome, Amir, to Intelligent Teams.
Hey, glad to be here.
Good to have you. Amir, could you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Sure thing. Hey, hello listeners. My name is Amir Atzmon. I combine three vocations, you can call it. I'm based in Tel Aviv, Israel, and I am an international improvised theater performer and instructor. I teach and perform playback theater and improv. Apart from that, I'm also a drama therapist and a somatic therapist. I have my own private practice here in Tel Aviv after a few years working in psychiatric hospitals. And I also translate, edit, and write psychoanalytic theory. Several publications and journals and an upcoming book chapter. Other than that, I do performance art wherever people want to invite me to play with them. I do improvised poetry on old typewriters, which is something that I've done quite extensively over the past decade here in Israel, and even more intensely throughout the 2 years of the war, working with evacuees and people who have lost loved ones in the fighting. So that's me more or less.
Great, thanks, Amir. And we met a few weeks ago at a Jewish cultural conference festival thing in England, in Birmingham, and each of those chapters are like, playback, interesting, translating psychoanalytic theory, interesting, like somatic therapist. I was like, okay, you're coming on the podcast, this is great. So maybe we'll take each of those quadrants or quintrants in turn and talk about what they are, give our audience a little introduction to them, and then think together about what that might look like for a team or for someone working with teams at work in their personal lives or something like that. So why don't we start with playback theatre? What is playback theatre?
So playback theater is a very, very unique and beautiful genre of theater. It was developed, I think, in the 1970s by a New York Jew named Jonathan Fox. He was looking for a way to establish a more kind of like communal and community-oriented theater. He wanted to create like an environment where people who are not trained actors could use theater to kind of like explore their day-to-day experiences, their challenges, without, having to buy tickets and going to Broadway, and, for them to have a theater that is down to earth and that serves their needs as a community. And he was drawing a lot on Jacob Moreno's psychodrama, which is a psychotherapeutic approach, which invites people to play together, in the studio, in the therapy room, by kind of like playing out each other's stories, each other's traumatic moments or powerful moments with close like family members or loved ones. And playback coalesced as this ritual where you have the ensemble on stage. Players who are not necessarily trained actors, but just, people from the community. And they invite someone from the audience to come up to the stage, share a personal story, and that story is then played back to them. So you have the players kind of like thinking of different ways to present this story, to highlight the different characters, the different emotions. There's an emphasis on kind of like finding the implicit themes, like which emotions are not openly acknowledged or discussed. How can we, both kind of like deconstruct and dream this story together for this person? And also, how can we reorganize it in different ways that bring out, different elements that might not have been as apparent. And I think that the essence is making someone feel seen, acknowledged, supported, and kind of like being like these very, very empathetic players that just aim to touch the heart of the story from a place that that touches their own, humanity and vulnerabilities. So this creates a very, very beautiful evening with different tellers coming up, sharing stories, and surprisingly, it has become a very, very popular form of entertainment in Israel. There are, I think, more playback troupes here than anywhere across the world. There's like dozens and dozens. There are like annual conferences, very vibrant community with people kind of like branching out into playback with dance or playback with just music, different languages, English, Hebrew, Russian, and it's just like a beautiful thing, like a community, like a tribal bonfire where people congregate and share stories and listen to each other and learn from each other. That's playback theater.
Great. That sounds beautiful. What attracted you to playback theater?
So I started out, I was just like, as a young man, I was really I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to make people laugh. That was just like one of my sole goals in life. I wanted to make people just, be so funny that people, do spit takes and have like their coffee, come up their nose. And I was working at a cafe in Jerusalem, and one day one of the regular customers asked me if I wanted to join an improv troupe. I did not know anything about improvised theater other than like watching Whose Line Is It Anyway on television. And I joined, this couple of like a ragtag gang of weirdo Jerusalemites. I don't know if people know this outside of Israel, but Jerusalem tends to attract pretty weird, intense people. So like of this group, one person is now like a jazz musician. The other person is another person is a documentary filmmaker. Another person creates Jewish-themed role-playing games. So really kind of like a crazy, inspiring bunch. And then we trained for about a year, and then we started performing. And that's how I got into improvised theater, and just like mostly doing comedy and shows. And about, I think, 6 or 7 years after that, after I've established myself as an improv kind of like performer and teacher, a friend of a friend who was like a leading playback theater director at the time just recruited me, just like said, hey, I want you to do playback theater. We're opening a course for people to join an already very successful performing playback theater troupe. And he just kind of like plucked me into that. And that was about 10 years ago. So that's how I got into both improv and playback, just the universe inviting me to do things.
It's interesting that you said it's become a very popular form of entertainment, because I see this, when you were describing it to me at first, as this really, sensitive, quite personal moment. Like a few months ago we had Zita Tulia Hikayo, who does systemic constellations workshops, and it's one person, group of people. It's very much like a closed group, and you sort of explore an issue together, and it's very sensitive, deep questions and all that kind of thing. And then it's like, now it's entertainment, and it's in front of hundreds of people, and my sort of sensitive story is being rolled out like that. So don't know, can you share a bit more about that dynamic between it being something that, with origins in the psychodrama therapeutic world, and you come to it as a therapist? I don't know if you bring extra therapeutic angle to when you do playback, versus it being this entertainment mode that is there to.
So I think I can give you an example, like one of a very, very meaningful moment for me as a playback facilitator and performer. So I think, first of all, there's something about Israeli culture that is maybe more open than a lot of other cultures or societies. It's a small country, it's a traumatized country. People are very, very kind of like, it's the Middle East. We're very open with each other. You can, take the bus and the person sitting next to you will tell you their life story, or, urge you to have children or not have children. It's very, there's something, almost like a kibbutz, like a small village where everybody feels entitled to meddle in everybody else's business. So there's something of that. And also I think because living here is very, very, very emotionally overwhelming, people really enjoy being able to share intimate moments or dilemmas in such a setting. Usually these are not like huge shows. Mostly it'll be like in smaller theaters, let's say up to like 80 people, 100 people in the audience maximum. It's like more intimate. And it's also used like, there's a lot of like, high school graduation events or companies or, government organizations where it's seen as a way of like, both processing, like people bring playback shows to like the end of year at a company. This is what we did this year, and we can use, playback as a way to share the stories and process. Or, just like, hospital teams, really every group of people who wants to do something that's entertaining and meaningful, they would get playback theater. And I think from that it just became something fun that you would go and watch, because it's heartfelt, it's moving, but it can also be very, very comedic. And I'll give you an example of a few years ago, my playback theater troupe was invited to do a show for the Social Security services here, who have a special branch dedicated to supporting people who lost loved ones in terror attacks. So, these are people whose, parents, children, siblings, spouses were injured or killed, the intifadas when we had buses blowing up, or, in any terror attack here in Israel, which are sadly happen every now and again. And it was in this, big, historically important venue in Jerusalem. I think about 100 people in the audience. We come up on stage, we do our little spiel, like our opening song, the music, and I start talking to the audience and asking them how they are tonight, what they're expecting to see. And then someone very, very, bluntly and loudly says, "I am here to be entertained. I am here to forget about my pain, my mourning, all the hassle of, being a bereaved family. I want to laugh. I want to just forget everything, put this all behind me, and just for one evening, I just want to be entertained." And then someone else comes up and says, half outraged, no. This is the one evening in the whole year where I can be where people understand my story, where I don't have to explain, and I want to touch that pain. I want to be with the memory of my loved ones, without, being afraid that I'm burdening someone, that I'm, trauma dumping, oversharing, because everyone here in the audience knows this experience. So this is where I can really feel free to be with my pain. So I think, the playback theater invitation is both of those things. It's like, hey, let's share stories and have fun and just play very lightly and humorously with the materials of life, but also we can have very, very meaningful, deep of traumatic experiences, of loss, of connection, of love, of intimacy, of mourning, and all of that.
How did you navigate that balance? I guess, and possibly neither of those people went home fully satisfied, or both of them went home partially getting what they wanted.
So I think from drama therapy, which is where really I'm really, really glad that I was able to kind of combine these different channels in my work, where I can be both a performer and a therapist. And in drama therapy, one of the theories talks about a concept called aesthetic distance. And that means the distance I need to be from an experience in order to be able to feel it. And, if the aesthetic distance is too short, then we're overwhelmed. It just becomes, traumatizing, overwhelming, too much. I can't even process it because it's so in my face that I kind of dissociate, or I'm just not processing. I'm just overwhelmed. If the aesthetic distance is too long, it's too far away, then I can't have an emotional experience because I'm just intellectualizing. I'm just kind of thinking from a very long distance about things, but I'm not really allowing them to touch me. And this can be very different for different people. Think about the way people favor different film genres. Some people want to go see a horror movie because they need that, in your face, terrorizing, scary, visceral experience. or some people like, heavy metal music. They need that intensity to have an emotional experience that's meaningful for them. Other people, would want something much more distanced, and they would go for something more minimalistic or more gentle. So when we perform playback theater, we try to balance. And what we did in that show is that we did like an opening number that took, different anecdotes that the audience shared in the beginning of the show, and we did some things which were more distanced and thus more comedic, and some elements that were less distanced and more heartfelt and more touching on the pain more, but also in a way that let the audience know that this is not about sticking it in your face. This is about still wrapping it in art, in artistic expression that creates enough of that distance for them to be able to be with it without feeling, oh, this is too much.
I've got a couple of avenues that I want to go down. Maybe I'll lay them out and we can choose your own adventure in the theme of your role-playing game friends way of doing it. It's one part of me is very aware that for our audience, talking about Israeli society and terror attacks and stuff like that will be very evocative of the current war and the current regime and politics and genocide and heavy, difficult stuff. And I'm holding this conversation with part of me going what is everyone else going to think if we're talking about this country that is so wrapped up in so much at the moment in the news and all this kind of stuff. So there's part of me that wants to I want to name that because I don't want to be sitting there being what's everyone going to think? I'm happy that we're having this space on the podcast and talking about people in Israel living normal lives, dealing with their own stuff, and how playback goes into that. So maybe there's a thing we can, I don't know. Maybe that's where I want to go, because there's other avenues. I want to go deeper into playback. I want to ask about it as a modality. I want to ask about it in the corporate setting as well. But I don't know. How do you respond to that? What's
so I think that is I can't talk about these things internationally without being very, very aware of the political situation, the horrific war that is. Nobody knows here if it's over or not or what's going to happen. The profound, generational scars left, and, the people in Gaza still, without proper, basic living conditions. As someone who works, both with the mind and emotions and with groups, I am very, very interested. And, I try to understand with all the different tools at my disposal, what the fuck happened to my country and my society. And we can talk about that, from the perspective of various, group analytic theories or, my experience in meeting people in Israel and the way that they think and experience things. And I think that there's something about, the extent to which Israel is a traumatized society. I'm going to focus on Israel for a moment. I have a lot to say about Palestinian society, and of course it's also a traumatized society. But I don't think I have the experience and understanding to talk about Palestinian society with any kind of authorities. Unfortunately, I can only offer the more one-sided observation on my own people. And I'll say that, first of all, Israeli society is very, 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 very traumatized. And trauma here is very layered. So you have, of course, just the underlying narrative, which is very, very intensely exploited by right-wing leaders and cultural figures, that Jews have been persecuted, envied, and just from time immemorial, the Jews have been the best people, the chosen people, the most moral people, and everyone else is just like jealous, and because we're such amazing, smart, gifted people, every other people on earth hates us and wants to destroy us because we're just so amazing. We're the chosen ones, like, this very kind of like narcissistic historical narrative that's been, that is pumped into the minds of like young people here, that just creates a very, very distorted notion of, what does it mean to be an Israeli? And so there's just Jewish history in general, leading up to, the events that preceded the Zionist movement's persecution in Europe, up to the Holocaust, which is very, very palpably felt here still. We still have, living survivors. A lot of people have intergenerational trauma, because we know, like, we speak of, second generation survivor trauma, third generation survivor trauma. There are still people carrying the pain and, the defense mechanisms of their parents and their grandparents. And it's I grew up, my grandfather was born in Germany. He came to Israel when he was 16, I think, in 1938. Other than his sister, he had lost his entire family. And he was a very important father figure to me. He pretty much kind of like raised me. He never talked about his experiences. But I can't help but wonder, he was a very like silent, introverted, gentle man. And I wonder what part of his, silenced pain seeped, into my mother, into me, into the way he lived his life. That's not just something that you can, get up and walk away from. And that's something that is touched, contaminated so many families here. So, all these layers of trauma, and they also intersect and interact with each other. And on top of that, all the wars and like the intifadas, like the Palestinian uprisings. I grew up in Tel Aviv, when buses were blowing up, and I lived right in the city center, and that was part of life, just buses blowing up. So much trauma. And I think that the complicated thing about Israel is that, as we know, trauma can create a victim mentality and a sense of, moral high ground. And I think that a lot of Israelis are really leaning into that in a way that does not allow them to realize or accept or admit war crimes, the atrocity that Israel is committing, or even like the reality of, the day-to-day reality of the occupation as a terrible system of oppression that is affecting millions and millions of lives. And of course, all these, this trauma and this sense of victimization are constantly exploited and manipulated by political and cultural figures on the right. And media, like television, radio, they're really playing along with this narrative. Like they have decided pretty early on in the war that they're not going to show any pictures from Gaza. So people living in Israel had no idea. Everything that the rest of the world saw, we didn't see. So it's just this very Orwellian reality here, I think, for most Israelis, where, it's an eternal war of good against evil, and of course the really like horrific, brutal, bestial violence of Hamas is being used to paint the entirety of the Palestinian people, or all of the people in Gaza, creating this narrative of there are no innocent bystanders, and thus any use of force is justified. And this is being, kind of like bought into by large sections of the Israeli public, which is, just so traumatized and brainwashed. So I think from a group perspective, if we think of, some classical theories into group mentality, we have Wilfred Bion, very, very important psychoanalyst, British. In the he's working with British soldiers coming back from World War II, And he's developing the first foundations of group therapy. And he publishes a very, very influential book called Experiences in Groups, where one of his insights into group mentality is that usually when we're in a group, we're all kind of thinking pretty much rationally and consciously, and we are able to get together and work for a certain end. We have a shared goal and we can achieve it. And he calls that this is the normal state of affairs, this is the work group. But the more pressure, the more stress, the more trauma, the more intense emotion there is, then the group has a chance of collapsing into what he calls proto-mental thinking. So instead of thinking rationally, and you can see kind of the roots of this argument in Freud's writing about groups and mob mentality, and he's drawing on writings and from the end of the 19th century, people writing about the masses, what happens to you when you become part of a mass of people. So Bion is identifying collapse to mostly unconscious, mostly irrational types of behavior. And one of the things that he's postulating is that, we have these fight, flight, freeze, physical instincts that we have. And groups can collapse into an unconscious fight, flight mentality, where you are being driven and managed as a group. Your whole outlook as a group becomes, we now need to fight or flight. It's black and white, it's us and them. There is no avenue for rational thinking, for details, for complexities. It's just us and them. The second type of collapse that he describes, he calls it dependence, where the group feels itself to be so threatened that it's helpless and it's passive, and it endows its leader with omnipotent and omniscient powers. And I think to a large extent, a lot of the traumas in Israeli society have created, Bibi Netanyahu as this kind of leader, where a lot of people, we call them Bibyists in Israel, really think of him as he's the anointed king, he's the Messiah, he's the one who's going to make everything better, despite, plenty of proof to the contrary. So I think what happened to us as a society is that we just completely collapsed. October 7th was so triggering that we lost our ability to think clearly and just became led into an unnecessarily brutal war.
Thank you for sharing all that, and especially from your own family and your own experience. I know it's not necessarily an easy thing to look at, and especially with the unspecified eye of the podcast audience who you don't know and who I don't know. What I'm interested in because I think we could probably talk about this for a couple of hours just on this topic, but then someone might reasonably ask, what's this got to do with intelligent teams? Maybe we could see as the most prominent example maybe of what you call a society that is in some ways collapsed and traumatized, and as this kind of organism that is Israeli society, given all the traumas and wars and awful things that have happened to people living there and in the surrounding places, and all the things they've been embroiled in. We now have a situation where we have a society that is struggling in all these different ways, and maybe in response to that is birthing all of these more therapists per capita in Israel than you can imagine elsewhere, which is both a privilege and also it's just an interesting thing to observe, or there's something that comes out of that we can look at. And I guess, and it feels like a bit of a trite maneuver, but allow me to try it and let's see where we can go with it, which is okay, so I'm in a company, I'm in an organization, I'm in a team, right? And I've been thinking about the idea of organizational trauma, team trauma, not as big as your holocausts, your displacements, your wars, but your redundancies, your mergers, your takeovers, your beloved CEO leaving, or your horrible CEO joining, or whatever. These are all, in my mind, on the similar, on this an equivalent spectrum, or maybe not equivalent, but a parallel spectrum of things that happen in our companies, which, you know, we spend more time with our companies than we do with many of our close family members. So when our organizations experience trauma, we get brought along in that in the same way that an Israeli citizen might get brought along with the national and cultural and local traumas of that they're experiencing, and that creates various dynamics, and it might need various modalities to work with it. So it feels like a trite thing because it's, you know, it's like, when our CEO came, we didn't like him. That was the same thing as the fascists rising to power in the right. But, you know, let's allow ourselves to play with that analogy, not too self-consciously. So I guess, like you mentioned, you know, playback theatre can come in to companies at the end of the year and help with this thing. Like, how might it work in a company where they've experienced difficult things over the last year, and there are cultural issues and the collapses you describe I've seen happen in teams as well. You know, it's us versus them. Why can't, you know, we need management to solve this for us because they're the ones that have the power to solve these horrible problems and this kind of thing. So yeah, can you maybe share some of the work or some of your thinking about how some of these modalities can help us in our more corporate settings, in our work lives?
Sure. There's one of the things that I do called applied improv or applied improvisation, which is when we take the principles of improvised theater, which is just this whole amazing set of soft skills of communication, trust, co-creation. It's basically how do we find the best way to work together in uncertain conditions? Because, you know, we don't have anything planned, so we need to really listen to each other and really build on each other in order to create, you know, an improvised performance. So I've had quite a bit of experience of like taking these principles and, you know, working with them in corporate settings, and I think it has maybe a couple of different layers. I think there's one of the most important things is, you know, what kind of organizational culture you create and what your role is as a team leader. You know, I teach, probably over like 10 to 12 to 15 hours a week, I teach improv theater. And I work with groups, and I have to be, you know, the best group leader that I can be. And I think my best advice comes from a really interesting interview. I don't remember the name of the researcher. She was interviewed on the Andrew Huberman podcast. She was an expert on parenting, and she said something really beautiful. She said that what children need is to feel safe and to feel real. And I think as a group leader, if I manage to provide my team members those feelings, then they have the optimal conditions to bring out the best in them. And safe in the sense of, you know, me as a leader, I am looking out for them, and I have their best interest in mind, and I am actively, you know, providing the conditions that they need in order to succeed. And also, I'm creating an atmosphere that is about collaboration rather than competition. It's about the free flow of information, about being responsive to each other's needs, and also real in the sense that I am attentive to them. I'm listening to them. I'm attentive to their ideas, to what they need. I'm seeing what's hard for them and what's easy for them. And so they don't feel like their experience or their emotions are irrelevant. And, you know, I have in my therapy practice, I have quite a few clients who work in like tech companies or corporate settings who are just describing very, very, very incompetent managers. Like people who are like, they set a goal, they have no idea what it takes to meet that goal, and just, you know, dump that on their team members and like go figure it out without, you know, proper, you know, of responsibility or you know, leading them. Or companies that just create like so much ego between the different departments that nothing can get done because this department is just loyal onto itself, and if somebody else like from a different part of the company is asking for something, they'll be like, no, fuck you. Like, that's the lowest priority for us, even though the entire company is devoted to making a single product. Then you have like these internal divisions and like this ethos of us versus them. So I would say, like, how can we make the people we're working with feel safe and feel real? And how can we, like, locate these, these collapsed places where it's collapsed to dependence, collapsed to fight or flight, and bring a different kind of energy into that.
So one of the things that when we met, I went to your playback poetry session, and you had a bunch of really interesting techniques for how to do that in a group level.
Mhm.
That's not how you described it at the time, but like how to make us feel real, how to help this group like land in that moment and do the work that you wanted to. So maybe we're zooming in from country level to corporate level to let's say as a facilitator or as a team leader, or someone that's holding space for a team. If I want to help them feel safe, feel real, you have a bunch of different lenses on how to achieve that, right? From how do I help my audience? How do I help my how do I work with my other improv players? How do I work with my clients? So could you share? It's a very broad. I imagine it's a broad question. It's like, hey, look at all the millions of things that you know. But where does someone start in trying to help their group in a more limited, a workshop, a meeting, feel real?
So I think I wanna kind of like just drop in another really interesting concept from the world of developmental psychology. There's this really interesting guy, Peter Fonagy. He has a lot of like brilliant theories, kind of like integrating attachment theory and psychoanalysis. And one of his conceptualizations is called epistemic trust. And what that means is this is the sense of I can learn something meaningful about my experience from this person. Like usually this is something that emerges in relationships between children and their parents, or children and like various mentor figures like teachers or like other family members. And there are different, what he calls cues, that indicate that this person is safe and good to learn from. And it can be things like eye contact, like tone of voice. And I think it's basically, when I'm facilitating, I try to model presence, attentiveness, receptiveness. It's like I try to make everybody feel, seen and felt and heard. And also I try to model like a playfulness, a calmness, a sense that, we're just exploring and experiencing and there's room for everything. And, I think with eye contact and with tone of voice and just like with facial expressions, you can really make people feel seen and attended to without doing a lot. Just kind of like attuning, even for a split second, to where they are can give them, the sense like, all right, this person has taken me into account. And something about their presence is calming to me, and I can, I feel safe to play or explore because I know that, there's somebody here who's like watching and holding this space. And I think a lot of exercises with eye contact or, taking turns and going around the circle, like making sure everybody has their moment of being seen and heard. I think when I first started teaching improv, and I became familiar with this concept of the warm-up. When we do theater work, we warm up. And in improv, the warm-up is physical and it's also mental and emotional and social. And I thought about, all the other learning environments that I've been in for, decades of my life, elementary school, high school, university, professional trainings. And in all those spaces, people very rarely use warm-ups. So like we're now entering a space, we're shifting into a different task, even though we're carrying with us, the rest of our day, our breakfast, our worries, our everything. And I think if we take even just a couple of minutes to clear the space and to connect and to build trust, then everything that follows is gonna be so much, it's gonna move so much more freely. And I think I'm not a dog person, but I have a friend who's like really into dogs, and she she told me that like the reason that dogs can get really, barky at each other is that, when strange dogs come across one another, they have this ritual that they need to do to make sure that the other dog is not a threat. They kind of like they sniff and allow each other to be sniffed, and that's how they know. All right, that like all right, we have this protocol for knowing that like this dog is not threatening. But a lot of people don't know that, so they will not let their dogs do that, and then the dogs they're very, very anxious because the protocol has not been performed yet.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same way with people. Like, why do we have handshakes? Why do we have, hellos? This makes us feel, on a very physical, biological, cave person level, wait, there's a strange person here. Can I trust him? And if we haven't done anything to assuage that anxiety, that concern, then people are just going to be on edge, even unconsciously.
The opposite of kill or be killed. It's sniff and be sniffed.
Yeah, because it's not just you doing the sniffing. You have to allow the other person to see that you're also vulnerable.
What might that look like? So, I'm running a meeting. I've got an hour and a half with these people. Maybe we're online, which adds a different set of constraints. Can you share some ideas for warm-ups for how to allow my team to sniff and be sniffed?
So it's been a while. Like we used to run so many online improv jams during COVID. It's been a while.
Well, maybe we start with like how to do it in person, and then we can adapt it. But some of those ingredients for a good win.
I think anything that would allow people, I think if we're in a group, we want to do two things. We want to make sure that people have entered the group, like feel that like, all right, I have a stake in this group. I've presented myself to this group. And we also want to have them, have these like one-on-one interactions. Make sure that everybody has met more or less everybody else so that, all right, I know who's in this space with me. I do this exercise with, with people dealing with trauma of orientation, which is just basically looking around. If you're very stressed out, you're just looking around the room, even looking specifically at the corners, just to tell like, your primitive brain, there is no predator here. So think about these exercises as just like, this is social orientation. This is, showing our brains, not our like conscious, rational, consciousness, but like our brains, our fight and flight brains, that this environment is a safe environment. And I think you can use any type of reciprocal interaction for that, which has eye contact and any kind of exchange. One of my favorite exercises is I have like a bag full of juggling balls, and when I start a workshop, I just put on some music and let everybody move around the room throwing balls to each other. Just throwing and catching balls. There's something profoundly relaxing and connecting about it. Like we've done something together, we've made eye contact. I gave you something, you gave me something. Now we're ready to work because we've engaged one another fully. So I think anything that, kind of uses those same elements, going around the circle, passing a clap, passing a word associations, even just like I'm sharing something about my day and I choose who's going to be the next person in the circle to do that. Even like, saying my name and, something that I like, which is a vulnerable thing to do. So anything that, I feel like I can put myself, like I've put a stake down in this group and I've interacted. And there's like really tons and tons and tons of ways to do that. And another thing that you can add is have the group kind of like acknowledge in any kind of way that, your contribution is seen and appreciated.
I love that. So there's a set of few different sparks for me because we do in meetings, we'll do a check-in, right? Which is, I think it's super important. Gets everyone talking, shows everyone that the tech is working, gives everyone a chance to have a voice, it gives everyone a chance to relax a little. But so as a connoisseur of these things, like what makes a good check-in and a bad check-in? Like for some reason there are some that don't work or they just feel routine, but the idea, I like all those ingredients you mentioned. So something reciprocal, acknowledgement from the group is nice. I know that when I've been in workshops where you say a thing and everyone goes, thank you, it
Yeah.
feels very different from just, now let's go around the circle. Yeah, the idea of giving and receiving is interesting. It's a really good, there's a practice that I do, which is, yeah, instead of the facilitator asking, right, now you, now you, now you, now you, asking the participants to choose the next person, that gives really good language as to why that works. It's like you're giving each other something. You're choosing the other person, other than the last person who gets chosen by default. But that's fine. It's it's an interesting way of thinking about it. And the improv world is full of ways of doing that really effectively and quickly, right?
Yeah, I would add, like, one of the things that we used to do when we did stuff on Zoom is, like, have someone, pick an object in their, in their space and say something about themselves or how they're doing through that object. Like, I have a glass of water, and then I can talk about, I'm having a clear day. And then I can kind of, like, do this thing of, like, passing my object to you, and you just pick it up as, like, a different object that you have. And that's just, like, a moment of synchronicity, which is another really important factor for creating, trust in groups. Anything synchronized that we can do is going to, create this sense of safety for us.
Like a kind of dance, like we dance in synchrony, and maybe we should we'll hit similar parts of our brain bodies if we could do our corporate check-in meeting things in synchrony. It hits the same.
Yeah.
Things.
Yeah, like even just taking like 3 deep breaths together, like stretching together, have, everyone like lead just a stretching movement. And also, like, one of the things that I use a lot is that after each person has spoken, I, as the facilitator, will acknowledge them or like add something onto that like provides recognition, maybe add some creativity, some humor. So kind of like to ease, the transition from one person to another, and to also tell them, I'm listening, I'm here with you, I got your back.
Maybe this is a good, talking of backs, I was interested in your somatic element of your work, and you mentioned somatic approaches to therapy, and here we're talking about stretches together and moving our bodies together. Can you give us a brief, what is a soma? What is a somatic approach to therapy? Why does that matter? Like, how can we incorporate it more? That's 3 very big questions, but
so I think that's a huge question. I'm not an expert in like the history, but I can share from what I've learned about maybe 2 of the leading modalities of somatic therapy. First of all, you have Peter Levine, another Jew. I think also like in the 1980s, he's developing an approach called somatic experiencing, where he is highlighting the role of the body's trauma response in mental health. So I think most people know our autonomic nervous system, our sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the nervous system.
Can you maybe give for those that may not know what those words mean?
So basically, our body has 2 basic modes. It has this fight-flight mode, which is like emergency, and it has like rest and digest. Everything's okay. I can go about my business. I can learn. I can engage socially. I can, go about my business. If I see a predator, if I see danger, then my body switches from the parasympathetic system, which is the rest and digest, that everything's okay, the normal state, into the sympathetic, which means now my body is completely devoted to getting me as much available energy so that I can either fight or run away. So this means digestion is shut down, heart rate goes up, the breathing becomes faster and more shallow, the blood circulation is doing different things, a lot of like blood and oxygen are pumped into the muscles, level of bodily tension is rising, so I have all this energy at my disposal to use it as I need to in order to survive. what Peter Levine kind of like discovered is that a lot of times, because as Western individuals, we're very, very dissociated from our bodies. And our bodies are very like, they're carefully monitored. And we've been trained from a very early age not to let the body express itself spontaneously. So what happens is that we usually, after we have a traumatic experience and our sympathetic system has been activated, we don't allow it to go through the process of finishing its activity. In order to do that, and we can see that in nature, they give the example of like, an antelope and a tiger and a savannah or a lion. The antelope, notices the predator, kicks into, sympathetic activation, all this energy pumping, manages to run away. Once it is safe, once an animal is safe after, this fight-flight activation, they will find a safe place. They will lie down on the ground and they will begin breathing very heavily and shaking. And what this does is, first of all, they get the signal that the traumatic situation is over. And second, they're allowing all this excess energy to be depleted, to be drained out of the body, just like shaking it off. And then they can resume and go back to fully engaging their parasympathetic, the rest and digest system. And what might happen for human beings, for people a lot of the time, is that we either never get this clear, all clear signal that the traumatic event is over, or we never allow our body to fully discharge this excessive survival energy. And when those things happen, then the body still thinks and lives and behaves as if we are still in, mortal danger. And that's where, according to this approach, that's where all the symptoms of PTSD come from. The edginess, the nervousness, the flashbacks, the nightmares, the anxiety, the rage, like anxiety associated with flight, rage associated with fight. All these symptoms are just survival energy. Like our body is primed to, do something very, very drastic to survive, but we've carried this on into our everyday life. So that is one approach. I think maybe just for brevity's sake, I can talk a little bit about polyvagal theory, which has been very popular in recent years. But I think what I want to emphasize more is I think that the rise of somatic modalities in the last, especially the last 10 and 20 years, has done something really important to psychotherapy, and that's they've shifted it away from being exclusively a thing of the mind, the psyche, the inner world. And, there's growing recognition of the fact that we are embodied beings, and bodies live in environments, and bodies live with other people. So there's something, about this shift that's like much more. It's not just about talking about feelings, it's about addressing the underlying systems and mechanisms, whether in terms of like our autonomic nervous systems or things like our attachment system. Polyvagal theory talks about like our social engagement systems, and all of these things have a physical, anatomical, biological, neurological, biochemical aspect. And the more we as therapists know how to work with that, then we have such a greater variety of tools at our disposal. And sometimes just talking about things is not enough. And that's when you have to introduce things that are more, all right, so where is the body holding this trauma right now? And how can the body help us release it?
Yeah, I think my interest in this is then, and how can we do this in our work settings, right? Because maybe we're probably not working with trauma in the same way in our software teams. But we are working with humans who are carrying whatever they're carrying. And if we only think about things in terms of ideas and words and stuff that happens internally in the mind, then we're missing a whole raft of options that could help us work with this group or help us build trust or discharge trauma in a similar way, right? This group has just been through this really intense restructure project, whatever redundancy period, we need to be able to work with that with as many modalities as are useful, and being able to acknowledge that our team members have bodies. That's okay. I notice that whenever I want to talk about the body at work, I always feel like HR is going to be on me for this, and it's. And just to reassure people, we're not doing anything that we shouldn't. But just even saying what is this for? What's happening in your body right now? How do you know that you're feeling stressed? Are there any sensations? The word sensation for me feels controversial, and there's so much work to do to be able to bring the corporate entities or the corporate culture towards.
So I think one example I can give, which is very, very basic to the extent that people don't usually think about it. Even think about the size of your meeting rooms. Are people cramped, or do people have space? And sometimes just if an environment is too cramped, even at a subconscious level, people will feel more on edge because they feel like they have to fight for their personal space. So just even minding, the fact that people need, or if the group is too big, the bigger the group, our brains and our bodies will process that differently, because we need to work on very different levels of intimacy. If it's 50 people, if it's 20 people, if it's 10 people, if it's 5 people, we're going to need to accommodate that as a leader, as a facilitator, because there are different things that we would want to do to make people feel more comfortable. So I think just addressing that, the relationship between the space and the amount of people, and also noticing, even just noticing when people are activated, are nervous, are showing signs of tension, of being agitated, and sometimes even just giving them a kind look and asking them if everything's okay, depending on the setting, we don't want to embarrass anyone. But even after a meeting, if you notice somebody in your team being nervous, and you approach them and just ask, curiously and politely, then that can make people feel a lot safer, because they know that, they don't have to hide it or go it alone. I think that's really important. And to this, I would add an important developmental mechanism, which is rupture and repair. If there is a rupture, if, you see someone being, their boundaries have been crossed, or they've crossed somebody's boundaries, how can you work as a team leader to repair that? To repair the rupture, either between you and that person, or between that person and the rest of the team. And actively addressing that can be really, really useful for building strong teams.
We're starting to run down on time. Are there any open tabs of things that you thought, I'd like to mention that you haven't had a chance to work in?
No, I think I think I'll have to say I'm not from the corporate world. And I usually work with specific companies on specific issues, so I don't really have something overarching to say. But I will say that I think it's really, really important for people to play together, and the more we find a way to make that happen for people, their connections are going to be better, their relationships are going to be better. There's going to be more trust. There's going to be more, kindness and support. Get people to play together, and but actually attentively. Don't have everybody, hey, let's go do laser tag, when half of the people can't stand it. Don't force it, but find something that works for most people, or divide them into groups that play together. I think that's really, really meaningful. Having a moment shared with a coworker where you see them being creative, being funny, where you can create something together, that's very, very meaningful. I think that's one of the highest forms of trust and safety and connection. It's the feeling that we've collaborated in creating something together.
That's a lovely point to end on. Amir, Atzmon, thank you for joining me in Intelligent Teams.
Daniel, thanks for having me, and thank you for listening, everyone.
Thank you for listening to the Intelligent Teams podcast. I've been your host, Daniel Susser. If you enjoyed this episode, there's a good chance you'll enjoy being a subscriber to the Intelligent Teams Substack. It's intelligentteams.substack.com. You'll receive a free weekly newsletter featuring an episode of this podcast, or writings about cognitive science and building intelligent teams. See you next time.